Hello, everyone, and welcome to Wall Street Hackers, Pod TV's number one TV show with your host, the one, the only Wall Street hacker, Peter Bennett, who has had many years of education and time on Wall Street. Peter has his bachelor's of economics from UCLA. He studied and received his law degree from the University of Miami Law School and an MBA in finance from New York University. Plus, he worked on Wall Street in finance for over 17 years. He continues to use his skills and resources, but not just for himself, but to share with you some tips so that you can learn how to survive all of this economic storm and make your investments work their muscles for you. And so join me in welcoming the one, the only Wall Street hacker, Peter Bennett. Hi, Peter.
Yeah, a nice introduction. I appreciate that. And I like the way you put that. So welcome everybody to Wall Street Hackers, new edition. You can almost every week, you can catch a new edition on either Thursdays or Saturdays, depending on your distribution channel. We always start with the market. So last week I said it, I like the way I put it, basically the markets have moved from delusion to confusion. So there's less talk about rate hikes. Now the debate is, will there be another quarter hike or half hike? But the delusions, which I've talked about for a year and a half, is it was always going to be, well, how much is it going to go down in the fall? Is it going to go down in the spring? Rates are going to be low. Everything's going to be a soft landing. Well, the market has sort of lost that conversation now. And as I said last week too, the bond market has accepted the theory of higher for longer. Last week, by the way, rates had hit about 5% long and short, and it was almost across the board around 5%. And I came out and said, you know what? It's not a bad time to buy bonds. There's never a guarantee on anything we say, as the disclaimers later we'll talk about, consult your financial advisor. But so that Sunday after our show, Barron's cover, Barron's, time to buy bonds. So at least some people, are saying that, there's never a guarantee again. But, to me, I said, especially in my Roth IRA, if I can buy 5% 30-year bonds, I'll lock it in. Look, sooner or later, rates are probably going down. The market fears that basically inflation will get out of control because of deficits. But I think it's going to be the opposite. And countries around the world will use yield curve control because they can't afford the interest rate. So that's going to mean, if they're successful, which is very likely, but not certain, then rates are going to go to zero in about 7 years. So that will be a shock in itself for the certain investments when and help others, because you won't be able to get a good rate of return on yield. But in the meantime, the problem is there's still confusion. So the good news is today, the rates actually are down below 4.7 already, just in a week. And the market is interpreting certain things Powell said about waiting for inflation to get under control. In other words, what he said, well, the 2% target might not hit in 2040. He seemed okay to say, we'll get to 2% in 25. But here's my problem. I don't think we're going to get to 2% in 25. And I think we're setting up, and we'll have this in our panel discussion, by the way, because we're going to be looking at what we think the real stock market returns will be over 10 years and long term. But the probably I think we're going to settle in on 3 to 4%, hopefully not higher, for a long, long time. So when Powell says higher for longer, the bond markets are now saying higher for longer. Wall Street Hackers has been saying higher for longer. That's not necessarily, to say the least, good news for stocks, because the market can react, okay, everything's great now, rates aren't going up, but what they're not looking at is the long-term earnings impact of higher interest rates on companies, because companies aren't affected generally that day. What happens is they have to refinance. They have to go to the bond market for refinancing, or they have to go to the banks, refinance. The economy in general runs on lower interest rates and is hurt by higher interest rates. So higher for longer means slower growth for longer. and a lot of headwinds for the economy. So it's not necessarily good news for stocks, although there's always opportunities, and there are today, I believe, very good opportunities as we discuss on the dividend picks of the week. So our theories is why it's going to stay longer, as always, is unemployment still is very low. Every week the report comes out, it's 200,000 over, 100,000 under. But when you look at $10 million jobs unfilled, basically, we have a long way to go. Also, oil and gas companies, we always highlight underinvesting by potentially 40% just to maintain energy prices where they are. Oil and gas companies are putting in 50% less than they used to before 2015. This is a long-term issue because they're putting 10% into ESG projects, environmental projects. They're being very cautious with their capital in case they have a terminal business or are going to be hurt by demand reductions later. And also just governments, especially the US government, but many European governments, all discouraging, putting in regulations, creating barriers. The Biden administration has created over 100 barriers to exploration and production, which is kind of weird. So I heard it said this week, it's like, why does the Biden administration love oil and gas from Iran and from Venezuela, and they're willing to get it, but hate U.S. oil production and gas production? This is one of the major problems. And also that relates more to those people who say, we need to cut it because of the environment. Well, fine. But the problem is the policies in effect are creating more carbon than ever. We have more carbon in 23 than 22, more in 22 than 21, worldwide and the U.S. How could that be? Well, because of really crazy policies, which we discuss almost every week. But you can't ship manufacturing and production to other countries which have less standards and think you're helping the world. It's just insane. It's all driven by politics, I guess. Anyway, besides that, I'm going to let the quotes of the week. I have a lot of quotes of the week this week, all from Barron's Dailies and Weekly, mainly from one article. But I thought it was all interesting, and it says a lot of what we've been saying. So number one is from former chief economist of AllianceBernstein, very sharp firm on Wall Street. They said, with nominal GDP growing at the fastest rate since the mid-'80s, the Fed should be looking to raise its policy rate further. Now, I don't think they're going to raise a whole lot more, maybe 0.25%. We've discussed that on Wall Street Hackers. I don't think the economy could take much more in the long run, and they're looking at the long run. He also said, well, the FOMC, the Federal Market Committee, is certain to stand pat this week. History shows it takes a Fed funds rate equal to or above GDP to slow the economy, and current target is still 0.75 below. And that is a point I brought up a year and a half ago. The rates need to be at close or to above the inflation rate than below, at least to have a fast impact. But maybe this will work. Nobody knows if you're close, but it's going to be a long, slow haul. Number three, the Fed forecast of a soft landing in 24 and rates of 2.2% inflation, real growth of 1.8% is a, quote, fairy tale outcome. And that's from the chief economist of BCA Research. I don't know who he is particularly, but he's talking about the fairy tale outcome, and I think that's true. He said, moderately high inflation might be welcomed in some quarters, especially by heavily indebted governments happy to see the real burden of their debt eroded. Yes, that is the point. Not only are governments going to need very low rates and inflation higher than rates to begin to swallow the massive underfunding of the current liabilities. You know, the U.S. is $33 trillion. That's a huge number, but also the unfunded liabilities that they won't even tell you about. Everybody worries about the $33 trillion and not in the U.S. $150 trillion potentially in unfunded liabilities, basically promising partly free medical care for aging populations in the U.S. But the world is in worse shape in many ways. Unfunded liabilities for their pension programs, government pensions, but also a lot of them have promised free medical care for aging populations and haven't put any money aside. This gets very expensive and is deflationary. So I think it's almost a guarantee you're going to see inflation over interest rates in the future, which makes investing very tricky in a way, in many ways. And finally, quote number 5, after keeping interest rates on hold for a second consecutive meeting, Powell talked about how much inflation was slowing rather than emphasizing strong growth. The Treasury had said it would slow down issuing long-term debt. That helped push up prices of bonds, and the yield of the 10-year, which had popped up to 5% not long ago, is now down to 4.7. So that's what I said. So the point is, there was fear in the market that the Fed would keep their quantitative tightening going. That's basically trying to slow down the economy by buying the treasuries, and that would have raised treasury rates. But I don't think they're going to do a lot of that anymore, because they know their strategy is what they've been telling us for a year and a half: higher for longer. And it might work in the long run. I have to give the first time the Fed credit. They were way behind the curve, and I complained and complained. But at this point, it's looking like it may work out, but it's going to be a long, slow haul, because the problem is it's going to be a slow adjustment. So maybe it'll be okay what they did in the end, but this isn't good news for the stock market, because the stock market is like, oh, rates will be down next year. And as soon as we start going into a slower economy, the Fed will be able to lower rates. But the problem is, again, that doesn't mean inflation is going down. I'd be surprised if we get under 3 to 4% inflation, unless we have a real catastrophe, maybe for the next decade or more or longer. At least that's my call, Wall Street Hackers call. 5 most interesting stories of the week. Number 1, everybody hears about this, and probably everybody knows about it: the massive pro-Palestinian, pro-Hamas demonstrations. I kind of understand to a point where somebody might argue pro-Palestinian, but pro-Hamas? I mean, you're talking about a group that just killed 1,400 civilians, chopped heads off, babies, and says they're going to do it again. And yet people are saying, yeah, Hamas. And it's largely in our Ivy League and other colleges, both. And it just shows the need, the massive need for a re-education system, a new education system, I should say, not re-education. That sounds Chinese. Anyway, we need a new education system. So, no, one, we desperately need charter schools, because charter schools create competition. It was a perfect example in Florida. They moved from one of the lowest educational rating states to one of the highest. Charter schools not only improved their students in every measure, reading and math, but also college admittance, but also they help the public schools, because competition is a good thing. If there's no competition, it's socialism. If it's competition, it's capitalism. Capitalism works. So these public schools were met with a challenge and said, we need to improve too, otherwise we'll be shut down or keep losing students. So they improved massively. Also, first thing I would do with the elite colleges and some of the others is say, you know what, you have huge endowments, you're not using a lot of the money for your students, you're not investment vehicles and hedge funds. If you have to invest, you have to pay taxes unless you're paying out a large percentage, much larger percentage to your students. You're not supposed to just be elitist funds. So that would be an easy one to do. I'd also start looking at the support of these colleges in general. You can't have an education system that teaches people Hamas is good, and not everybody, obviously, but a lot of people in these institutions, or the United States is bad. It's like, it's not that simple, first of all, even with the United States, but generally, the United States has been a very positive force for the world. First democracy. We probably all have kings, if not for the United States. World War II probably would have been lost, I would have said. So there's a huge positives, and it's not without flaws, but give me a break. You need an education system that supports a society, not denigrates it. An interesting story number 2, graphite is apparently an important new weapon for China, which I didn't know, but over half of the weight of an EV, you would have thought is lithium, but it's graphite, the same graphite that you use in number 2 pencils. So the U.S. recently restricted certain chips for defense purposes and whatever, reasonably going to China. So China now just put in a law starting December 1st that they're going to require licenses to export graphite around the world. So this is a real warning to the United States. And there's so many notes on this point that it brings out. Number one, you're never going to see giant, I hope you would, but you won't. And it sounds crazy to say, I hope you would, but you're never going to see giant blast furnaces in the United States or Europe or whatever compared to China, because China doesn't care about the environment. But the United States is like, okay, it's okay if we spend our money and buy it in China and they pollute the world. But China and India are becoming larger and larger polluters and increasing carbon as part of the terrible government strategy on the environment. Also, this could affect the whole EV industry down the road because they are very dependent on Chinese exports of graphite. So that was interesting. And in general, the tensions between China, there's more that needs to be done there. Number three, interesting story. Apparently now it's much cheaper to rent than to buy. So the average mortgage payment is a whopping 52% more than the average monthly rent on a house or apartment. And that is the highest ratio of housing over apartments or rentals of houses since 2008 crash. And historically, it's pretty even. Rent or buy is pretty even in terms of cost. But with the rates at 8% on mortgages, roughly, it's shifted. So one very negative thing for inflation and everything else in that battle is, well, rents are probably going to go higher then because people aren't going to be less likely to buy if it's so expensive. And that's going to drive inflation because rent's a big factor there too. Two anti-tech stories, very interesting, health issues, both of them, and kind of directly and indirectly related. A company called the Buck Institute, a nonprofit institute in California, says that eye damage can lead to damage to other vital organs and even a shortened lifespan from basically spending too much time on screens. They said dysfunction of the eye can actually drive problems in other tissues. Staring at a computer and phone screens and be exposed to light pollution well into the night is particularly bad, are conditions very disturbing to circadian clocks. Every cell in the body operates on a circadian clock. A person's circadian clock, we know, sets the timing for many bodily functions, including sleep, hormonal activity, body temperature, rhythm, eating and digesting. And so that's interesting. I mean, we are an information age society now, and people spend an inordinate amount of time. Another point about this is parents reported children's screen time has now jumped from 3/4 of an hour to as high as 6.5 hours per day. And that's also largely due to online school-based requirements. So the schools are forcing the kids to look at the screens. Maybe it helps, maybe education in some ways, probably, but on the other side, maybe not. But health-wise, there's big issues. And then also, especially relating to kids, and this is a very interesting story, number 5. In a jointly filed federal suit, a group of 33 state attorneys allege that Facebook and Instagram are using, quote, incessant notifications to keep teens glued to their phones, where they are engaging in unrelated activities such as attending school. Their methods include phone vibrations, pulses, sounds, banner notifications, emails, and badge notifications that display a red indicator, and also showing how many unread messages they have. The allegations, which accuse Mark Zuckerberg's social media giant of fueling a giant youth mental health crisis over profits. And they cite poor sleep patterns, depression, anxiety, and teenagers' fear of missing, messages and also dopamine manipulating recommendation algorithms. Facebook, I'm not a big fan of, although they have their purposes for family, whatever. But oh my gosh, it's a crazy tech world in a way. a client I have said, what happened? Information was supposed to help us, and now our customer service has gone down. So we wait so long, so much oftener to get a live rep. Sometimes frustrating too, but that's an adjustment. But this stuff on Facebook and kids and screen time, this isn't going away soon. So I have issues. Anyway, we'll take a quick break and we'll be back with the discussion of the week and the investment recommendation of the week. See you soon. Do we have that, Kim? If not, I'll just keep going. Kim, let's skip the ad because it's 1:21, and I'll just keep moving. So what to do, as always, we always say this: energy and especially pipelines are a great place to be. As a matter of fact, MPLX, one of our keys, my largest pipeline allocation and energy allocation, actually my largest allocation other than bonds, was just had almost a 10% rate increase. Also, KRP, which is a royalty trust, I've recommended in the last few weeks, just jumped up today, but their dividend jumped up very dramatically. Oil and gas royalty trust is about a 3% allocation there. It's a good hedge against everything else. Be defensive. It's a crazy time for the market. And another key point is this, very clear, based on 50 years of history, we need to own dividend stocks rather than regular stocks because over that 50 years, they doubled and tripled the performance of the S&P 500. There's a little clicking maybe going on. We have to watch that. Okay, so the investment stock of the week, I gave this a few weeks ago, but I loved it at 8. This morning, it was almost at 7. It just jumped up 6.5% today. So it's a little worse, but I still really love the investment, and it's Slate Retail REIT. Slate Grocery REIT. It used to be SR. It's SRRTF. It used to be called SR Retail REIT. But it's so much of my favorite. It's my largest by far non-energy, non-bond allocation. And it's 8% roughly of the portfolio now. Basically, I put my whole profit sharing plan in there. It's best to own it in an IRA or profit sharing plan because there's a 15% Canadian withholding tax unless you're Canadian. But that way you don't get double taxation because you'd have to pay taxes on the taxes, and that's complicated. So what do I love about it? Pretty much everything. It's open air shopping centers, and people need to go to these, especially since every one of their centers is anchored with a grocery. So this guaranteed traffic. I don't think groceries are going away, and people go there, and I don't see a whole lot of vacancies in any groceries I've seen in Travels or anything centers. But also, they're not building a whole lot of open air shopping centers anymore because construction costs are real high. So there's a lot of demand, and there is not a lot of new supply. Also, it's mostly southern, where the hot population and demographic growth is tremendous. So they're very sharp strategically. Also, their rental rates on their properties are well below market. So every year when their groceries come due, they get pretty big increases in their rents, which just in case interest rates go up, well, that's going to offset some or all of it. It should mean more growth. The yield as of this morning was, I think, 12.3. I think it's 12 now because it just jumped 6-something%. But it was covered by the cash flow. So if I can get 12%, maybe a little more to me, the safest type of investment, I would say it's, in my opinion, by the way, this is for entertainment only. Sorry about that. It's just opinion, no guarantees, and consult your financial advisor. Forgot to give that. Anyway, so if I can get 12% in an IRA, tax-free, basically, or 401k or whatever, and at what I think is safer than almost every other stock, or maybe except for maybe energy, it seems like a good bet. And my guess is when interest rates even begin to really go down a little bit, eventually they're going to have to, or stabilize, and then it can't stay at 12. It'll probably get some nice appreciation. So, panel discussion of the week. Question, and Kim will be coming on, I believe. What will the S&P 500 earn in the next 10 years and also in the long run? And there's Kim. Hey. So before we get into that question of what we expect the S&P 500 and to earn 10 years long run, quick background. One, many studies show that S&P 500, depending on the years, but a lot of studies show over good amounts of time earns about 10%. One study said over 100 years it got about 10%. So that's a pretty good yield. On the other hand, returns have been definitely boosted, jacked up by decreasing interest rates over the last 40 years. Because other than the last fluctuation of down during COVID and up now, basically rates have been steadily going down. So that's the psychology. Because it was one thing when you could buy a bond, 30 years ago, 40 years ago at 14%. Then why do I need a stock? Now it's going down, 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 almost in a straight line. So that's helped, build that. Also, a very important point is demographics. So this is, to me, maybe the best study I ever read. It was in Barron's about 20 years ago. I read this somewhere in there. And it said that they took 1,000 years of stock market return. I say, how did they get that? The United States has been around 1,000 years. Well, they looked at England for a long time. I think maybe 400 years in England. I don't remember. Japan and the United States. And they studied them all. And they said, here's the pattern we notice. When populations under 50 are growing relative to those over 50, the stock market goes up. When populations over 50 are growing relative to under 50, stock market goes down. And the amazing thing was the correlation was just about 1.0. Now, you never get a 1.0 correlation, but that was such a clear correlation, almost perfect. It was like almost a formula. Will it, go forward? The future, you could never tell, but it was 1,000 years and it seemed to work every time. Now, why would that be? Well, there's a few reasons why, but it's really pointed out by Gallup data. So if you look at April 23rd Gallup poll, 61% of adults own stocks in the United States, and I'm sure a lot in the world, obviously. So they asked the question, when you retire, how much do you want to rely on each of the sources of money? IRAs, 401ks, and TIOs, retirement savings accounts. And they said 48% would be relying as a major source. 30% said a minor source, and only 21% said not a source. Then they said, what about individual stocks as a source? 22% said a major source, 37% said a minor source, and 40% said not a source. How much do you currently rely on sources of income today, like your IRA, 401k, or retirement savings? 27% already say it's a major source, 33% a minor source, and 39% said not a source. So you take that and you say, what people are saying is what the reason for the study. As people are aging into 50 or 60, they're saving money because they're saving for retirement. As people retire, they're starting to spend down their assets. They need money to live. Inflation is going to make that much worse. So as they take that out, that's going to affect ratios in the market, PE ratios, and also maybe those people who had so much wealth and spend will be spending less, especially if inflation eats away at their savings. That's why it's so important to invest in the right things. I have my conclusions, but what do you think, Kim, for going forward 10 years and for even longer term, 10%, 6%, more or less? What do you think?
I think sometimes the stock market is like going to Vegas, right? And you just really have no idea.
Right.
I believe that, our controlling factor has been a lot of what the Federal Reserve has been doing. But overall, like you said, the majority of the time, our average has been 10%. Over 70% of the years we have gained. We haven't had losses, but we've had gains. So that's a good sign that this will turn around. I've spoke with my financial advisor, and if you pivoted the right way during this downturn and listened to some of these things, like my stocks, we pivoted and I made 20%. this quarter. So,
I'm sure
I
you
mean,
definitely
it could
can,
go, yeah. So it can work in your favor, but you have to do a lot of work, as you know, do a lot of research and know where to invest. But I believe in the long term, it's going to have to improve again. And we're just going to be at an average of 10% like we
You're
always
going to go
are.
back to the average. That, you
Yeah,
know what? You could
I
easily, you could
think one
easily
more
be right.
thing though that
Right.
is interesting, because I had this conversation with someone yesterday
Mhm.
that he said that he did some meetings in the Federal Reserve, was listening to some things, and they have said that they're going to have to correct the interest rates so that people will start doing more spending, and they will be doing this in 2024. And I often, over the years, and maybe I need to go sit down and do my homework, does the Federal Reserve control the swing vote? And will this control the swing vote for presidency?
Oh, this is going to have a huge, well, the swing is
Impact,
still on.
exactly. So
But
if
yeah,
it switches,
the economy, that's a whole nother show. We'd have to do a whole
yeah,
show on this. How is the economy going to affect the elections, not to mention geopolitical events? But we try even to avoid politics in a way, because we know half the audience loves one, half the other audience, the other love the certain issues we just have to address. But and I will say we try to take the balanced approach too, to a good extent, on the politics. So a couple of conclusions. One, I believe aging and demographics in the U.S. and the world will affect the market. It's a headwind. It's a clear headwind. It was a 1-for-1 correlation. No matter what they say the last 100 years gave, it's going to be an issue. Number two, AI is a wild card, a total wild card, because on one side, it's going to improve companies' profitability. But the problem is you're going to be improving profitability at the expense of hiring people. And I believe there's a huge danger in the next 10 years and less of AI replacing a lot of jobs that won't be replaced. Now, that's going to be a danger in terms of, for the economy, in terms of demand, because people who are going to be living off of government allocations, or, they can't get good jobs anymore because AI is replacing everybody. As a footnote, the company came up this week with the first CEO, AI robot CEO, and they're serious about it, but we'll see if, how that works out. But number three, I think inflation is going to settle in at 3 or 4%. And I don't think the Fed is ever going to get down to 2. Chairman Powell already said, well, we're not expecting 2 next year, now 25. Yeah, right. Let's see if it gets to 2. I don't think so, because governments want inflation anyway. They need inflation. So I think inflation is going to run, if I was guessing, again, everything's a guesstimate, nobody knows, 3 or 4%. And that's going to hurt the market, because the market is priced right now for really low rates. And they're not accounting for the fact that this is going to if interest rates stay high, and I don't think they can even stay at 4.7 in the long run, but let's say they stay at 4, because they can't lower them because inflation's at 4, then it's going to start eating away. And there's so many other issues, the office market, there's a lot of issues right now that need to be straightened out. So my guesstimate, and it's total guess, is maybe 6% over the next 10 years and longer. And that's not a bad return, but the problem is right now you can get 4.7, or you can get almost 5, maybe, whatever, depending on the day, in a bond. And you say, why do I need to take fluctuations in the market, especially in a retirement account? And it's not as appealing, but there's never a guarantee. And I would highlight 2 last things. One, it all depends what sectors you're in anyway. So we're in a time of change. So it's so important to pick the right sectors, like energy, I say, and other really good companies that are going to be surviving in the next 5, 10, and 20 years. Other companies are going to go to the wayside. And it's so important also to own dividend stocks with whatever allocation, because those are going to outperform very likely in the future. So unfortunately, we're out of time. As always, it flies by. As Kim always says, get healthy, get wealthy. One of my favorite expressions. And thanks for watching. And we will see you next week. We'll have another edition of Wall Street Hackers. Tune in then. Thank you. See you soon, Kim.
Thank you. Take care, Peter. Well, everyone, don't forget to watch Wall Street Hackers to get your tips and enlightening, entertaining stories of what's happening this year and in the current events. Take care, and we'll see you next Thursday at 1 Eastern Standard Time.